3,000 years ago, there existed an empire so powerful that Egypt's greatest pharaohs trembled at the mention of its name. Yet today, most people have never heard of it. This is the story of the Hittites, a civilization that wielded iron weapons when the rest of the world still fought with bronze, commanded the first international peace treaty in human history, and built an empire that stretched from the Black Sea to the gates of Babylon. By the end of this video, you'll discover why this forgotten superpower shaped our world in ways that still echo today. Picture the ancient world around 1400 before Christ. The golden sands of Egypt stretch endlessly under pharaohs who believe themselves gods among mortals. To the east, Mesopotamian cities rise like jewels along the fertile rivers where civilization first bloomed. Between these titans of antiquity lies Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, a rugged land of mountains and valleys that most consider a mere crossroads for trade caravans. But beneath this seemingly quiet landscape, something extraordinary was stirring. In the highland fortresses and mountain passes, a people were forging the future with hammers that rang against iron anvils. The Hittites weren't just another ancient tribe struggling for survival. They were revolutionaries who would rewrite the rules of warfare, diplomacy, and empire building. Their story connects to something we all understand: the desire to protect what we love and the courage to stand against seemingly impossible odds. Every family, every community, every nation has faced moments when everything they cherish hangs in the balance. For the Hittites, that moment lasted for centuries, and their response would echo through history. This empire emerged from the shadows to challenge the mightiest powers of their age. They faced Egyptian war chariots that had conquered half the known world. They stood against Assyrian armies that left entire cities as monuments to terror. They negotiated with Babylonian kings who commanded the loyalty of millions. And somehow, from their mountain strongholds, they not only survived but thrived. The mystery at the heart of their civilization runs deeper than military conquest. How did a relatively small population create technologies that wouldn't be matched for centuries? What diplomatic genius allowed them to negotiate as equals with empires 10 times their size? And perhaps most intriguingly, why did they vanish so completely that until 150 years ago, we didn't even know they had existed? Before we dive into this forgotten empire story, I want to make a special invitation. If you enjoy narratives like this one and want to follow more content like this, consider subscribing to the channel, leave a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos when they come out. This support is fundamental for us to continue bringing quality content to you. Now, let's get to the story. But to understand how a mountain people could forge an empire that would make pharaohs write desperate letters begging for peace, we must travel back to a time when the very concept of iron was still a closely guarded secret, and witness the rise of a king whose name would become legend. The year is 1650 before Christ. The ancient world pulses with the rhythm of bronze hammers and the thunder of wooden wheels. In Egypt, the Middle Kingdom pharaohs are rebuilding their glory after centuries of foreign rule. Mesopotamian city-states wage eternal wars along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. The Minoan civilization flourishes on Crete, their ships carrying precious goods across the Mediterranean's blue expanse. Yet in the heart of Anatolia, something unprecedented is taking shape. The rugged highlands that rise between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean weren't just a barrier between civilizations. They were a crucible where a new kind of power was being forged, literally and figuratively. The early Hittites didn't burst onto the historical stage as conquerors. They began as scattered tribes speaking an Indo-European language, relatives of the peoples who would later become Greeks, Romans, and Celts. But unlike their wandering cousins, these mountain dwellers had discovered something that would change everything. Hidden in the iron-rich hills of central Anatolia lay the secret that would make them masters of their world. Iron. Not the soft, workable iron that occasionally fell from the sky in meteorites, but true smelted iron, harder and sharper than any bronze blade. While Egyptian weapons shattered against Hittite iron, while Mesopotamian armor crumpled under iron-tipped spears, the Hittites guarded their metallurgical secrets more carefully than any treasure. Around 1600 before Christ, a king emerged who would transform these scattered mountain clans into the foundation of an empire. His name was Hattusili I, and he understood something that would define Hittite success for the next 5 centuries. True power came not just from superior weapons, but from the wisdom to use them strategically. Hattusili established his capital at Hattusa, a fortress city carved into the living rock of the Anatolian highlands. The location was no accident. From these heights, Hittite scouts could observe the movements of armies days before they arrived. Mountain passes could be defended by a handful of warriors against thousands. And most importantly, The iron mines that fueled their technological advantage lay safely beyond the reach of foreign raiders. But Hattusili faced a challenge that would test every great empire builder in history. How do you unite fiercely independent mountain tribes who have spent generations fighting each other? His solution revealed a diplomatic genius that would become a hallmark of Hittite civilization. Instead of ruling through fear and overwhelming force like most ancient kings, Hattusili created something revolutionary: a confederation. Local chiefs kept their authority over their own territories, but swore allegiance to the Hittite king in matters of war and external affairs. This system allowed the empire to expand rapidly without the constant rebellions that plagued other ancient powers. The king's most brilliant innovation was the creation of the royal succession law, the first constitutional monarchy in recorded history. Unlike Egypt, where pharaohs were considered living gods, or Mesopotamia, where kings claimed divine mandate, Hittite rulers established clear rules for succession that prevented the civil wars that destroyed other dynasties. Hattusili's military campaigns began modestly, securing trade routes and subjugating neighboring city-states. But each victory brought new resources, new warriors, and new technologies. The Hittites weren't just conquerors. They were collectors of knowledge. Every defeated enemy taught them something new about warfare, administration, or craftsmanship. The king's greatest test came when he decided to challenge the established powers of the ancient world. In 1595 before Christ, Hattusili launched an audacious campaign that shocked every royal court from Egypt to Iran. He marched his iron-armed warriors down the Euphrates River, bypassing the heavily fortified Assyrian territories, and struck directly at the heart of Mesopotamian power. The target was Babylon itself, the jewel of the ancient world. For over 1,000 years, Babylon had stood as the symbol of Mesopotamian might, its walls seemingly impregnable, its king ruling over millions of subjects. The very idea that mountain barbarians could threaten such a magnificent city seemed impossible. But Hattusili had studied his enemies carefully. He knew that Babylon's strength lay in its defensive walls and its vast population, but these same advantages could become weaknesses. The city required enormous amounts of food and water, making it vulnerable to siege. Its wealth made it an irresistible target, but also meant its defenders were more concerned with protecting treasure than fighting to the death. The Hittite assault on Babylon wasn't a prolonged siege. It was a lightning strike that combined tactical brilliance with technological superiority. Iron weapons cut through bronze defenses like knives through silk. Hittite chariots, lighter and faster than their Mesopotamian counterparts, struck the city's gates before defenders could organize resistance. When Babylon fell, the ancient world held its breath. A city that had weathered countless attacks from neighboring powers had been conquered by a people most had never heard of. The psychological impact rippled across every royal court in the known world. If Babylon could fall, nowhere was safe. But Hattusili's greatest victory contained the seeds of an unexpected challenge. The Hittites had proven they could conquer, but could they rule? Babylon was too far from Hattusa to govern effectively, and holding it would require resources the growing empire couldn't spare. The king made a decision that revealed the strategic thinking that would define Hittite policy for centuries. He sacked the city, carried away its treasures and craftsmen, but didn't attempt to hold it. This wasn't mere raiding. It was a calculated demonstration of power designed to establish the Hittites as players in the great game of ancient geopolitics. Every king in the region now knew that the mountain people possessed both the will and the capability to strike anywhere, anytime. The return to Hattusa marked the beginning of a new chapter in Hittite history. The empire had announced itself to the world, but now it faced the even greater challenge of consolidating power and defending against the inevitable counterattacks from enemies who would never again underestimate the mountain warriors. But what no one expected was that the next king to inherit this growing empire would face a threat that would test not just Hittite military might, but the very survival of their civilization. The throne passed to Mursalai I, Hattusili's grandson, around 1530 before Christ. The young king inherited more than just a crown. He inherited enemies. Every power in the ancient world had taken note of Babylon's fall, and none were willing to let this mountain upstart grow stronger. But the greatest threat to the Hittite Empire wouldn't come from foreign armies or rival kings. It would emerge from within the royal palace itself. Palace intrigue in the ancient world was a deadly art, and the Hittite court proved no exception. Mursalai's own brother-in-law, a man named Hantili, had been watching the young king's success with growing resentment. The conquest of Babylon had brought immense wealth to Hattusa, but it had also created new pressures and new enemies. Hantili whispered to anyone who would listen that Mursali's aggressive expansions were leading the empire toward disaster. The conspiracy that followed would become one of the most shocking betrayals in ancient history. During what should have been a moment of celebration after another successful campaign, Mursali was assassinated by his own relatives. The king who had consolidated his grandfather's conquests and extended Hittite influence throughout Anatolia died not in glorious battle, but at the hands of those he trusted most. Hantili seized the throne, believing he could stabilize the empire through more cautious policies. But he had fatally misunderstood the nature of ancient power. The Hittites had built their reputation on strength and decisive action. When word spread that their king had been murdered by his own family, every enemy they had made saw opportunity. The empire that had seemed invincible just years before began to crumble with shocking speed. Assyrian armies reclaimed territories in the southeast. Local chieftains who had sworn allegiance to Hattusili declared independence. Most dangerously, the Hurrians, a powerful people from the region of modern-day northern Iraq and eastern Turkey, began organizing a confederation specifically designed to destroy Hittite power forever. What followed was a period historians call the Dark Age of the Hittite Empire. Nearly 2 centuries when the Mountain Kingdom fought desperately just to survive. Kings rose and fell with alarming frequency. Some ruled for mere months before falling to assassins or dying in hopeless battles. The iron weapons that had once guaranteed victory seemed powerless against the chaos consuming the empire from within. During these dark decades, one lesson became crystal clear. Military technology alone couldn't sustain an empire. The Hittites possessed the finest weapons and most advanced metallurgy in the ancient world, but without political stability and unified leadership, these advantages meant nothing. The low point came around 1400 before Christ, when the empire had shrunk to little more than the immediate vicinity of Hattusa itself. Foreign armies raided Hittite territories almost at will. The great fortress city that had once commanded respect from Babylon to Egypt now struggled to control even its own mountain passes. Yet from this apparent collapse, an extraordinary figure emerged who would not only restore the empire but transform it into something greater than Hattusili had ever imagined. His name was Suppiluliuma I, and his rise to power around 1344 before Christ marked the beginning of what historians now call the Hittite Golden Age. Suppiluliuma understood that the empire's survival required more than military victories. It demanded a complete reimagining of how power worked in the ancient world. Unlike his predecessors who had focused primarily on conquest, this king would become the ancient world's greatest diplomat, a master of what we might recognize today as international relations. His first challenge was immediate and existential. The Hurrian Confederation, now organized into the powerful kingdom of Mitanni, had spent decades preparing for the final destruction of Hittite power. Their armies outnumbered the Hittites by enormous margins. Their territory stretched from the Euphrates to the Zagros Mountains. Most ominously, they had formed alliance with Egypt, creating a pincer movement that seemed certain to crush what remained of the Mountain Kingdom. But Suppiluliuma had been studying his enemies as carefully as his grandfather had studied Babylon. He recognized that the Egyptian-Mitannian alliance, while formidable on paper, contained fundamental weaknesses. The two powers were natural rivals, united only by their shared fear of Hittite resurgence. If that alliance could be broken, each enemy could be dealt with separately. The king's solution was breathtakingly audacious. Instead of preparing for defensive warfare, he decided to launch simultaneous offensives against both enemies, but not in the way anyone expected. Rather than attacking their armies, he would strike at their credibility, their trade routes, and most importantly, their ability to trust each other. Suppiluliuma began by launching lightning raids into Mitannian territory, not to conquer cities but to capture something far more valuable: information. Hittite intelligence networks, refined during the dark centuries of survival, had become the most sophisticated in the ancient world. They knew which Mitannian nobles were dissatisfied with their king, which trade routes were most vulnerable, and most crucially, what secret messages were being exchanged between Mitanni and Egypt. The intelligence war that followed was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Hittite agents spread carefully crafted rumors designed to make each ally suspect the other's loyalty. They intercepted diplomatic correspondence and sometimes allowed altered versions to reach their intended recipients. They bribed officials in both kingdoms to provide information that could be used to predict enemy movements. But Suppiluliuma's masterstroke was yet to come. Through his spy networks, he learned that the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep III was growing old and ill, and that the succession was uncertain. The king realized that this moment of Egyptian weakness provided an opportunity that might never come again. In a move that shocked every royal court in the known world, Suppiluliuma sent ambassadors not to Egypt's enemies, but to Egypt itself. The message they carried was revolutionary. The Hittites were prepared to abandon their conflict with Egypt and instead focus their full attention on destroying Mitanni, but only if Egypt would remain neutral during the coming war. The Egyptian court was stunned. For decades, they had viewed the Hittites as dangerous barbarians to be contained or destroyed. Now these same barbarians were proposing a sophisticated diplomatic arrangement that would serve Egyptian interests while solving their Mitannian problem. Pharaoh Amenhotep, weakened by age and focused on domestic challenges, found the Hittite proposal irresistible. Egypt would step back from its Mitannian alliance, leaving their former partner to face the mountain warriors alone. In exchange, the Hittites would ensure that their conquests in Syria and Mesopotamia didn't threaten Egyptian trade routes or tributary states. When news of Egypt's withdrawal reached the Mitannian capital, panic set in. The kingdom that had spent decades preparing for the final assault on Hittite power suddenly found itself facing that power alone. And worse, facing a version of that power that had grown far more sophisticated and dangerous during its years of struggle. Suppiluliuma's military campaign against isolated Mitanni was swift and devastating. But this wasn't the crude conquest that had destroyed Babylon 2 centuries earlier. This was precision warfare designed not just to defeat enemies, but to permanently alter the balance of power in the ancient world. However, as Mitannian resistance crumbled and Hittite armies advanced toward the Euphrates, something unexpected was stirring in the Egyptian royal palace. The old pharaoh was dying, and his designated heir had plans that would threaten everything Suppiluliuma had worked to achieve. The message arrived at Hattusa on a summer morning in 1323 before Christ, carried by a travel-worn Egyptian messenger who had ridden hard across hundreds of miles of desert and mountain passes. What he bore was perhaps the most extraordinary diplomatic correspondence in ancient history, and it would lead to events that no one could have predicted. The letter was from Queen Ankhesenamun, widow of the pharaoh Tutankhamun, the boy king whose tomb would fascinate the world thousands of years later. But in that moment, she was simply a desperate woman facing an impossible situation. Her young husband was dead, possibly murdered, and the powerful priests and generals who truly ruled Egypt were pressuring her to marry a man she despised. A choice that would seal her fate and potentially destroy her family's dynasty. Her letter to Suppiluliuma was unprecedented in ancient diplomacy. Never before had an Egyptian queen written directly to a foreign king, especially not one who had recently been Egypt's enemy. But her words would echo through history. "My husband is dead and I have no sons. I have heard that you have grown sons. If you would send me one of your sons, he could become my husband and king of Egypt." The Hittite court was stunned into silence when this message was read aloud. An Egyptian queen was offering to marry a Hittite prince and place him on the throne of the pharaohs. It would mean the peaceful conquest of the world's oldest and richest empire, achieved not through iron weapons or siege warfare, but through a marriage alliance that would unite the two greatest powers of the ancient world. Suppiluliuma, however, was too experienced a diplomat to accept such an incredible offer without careful consideration. This could be the opportunity of a millennium, or it could be an elaborate trap designed to lure a Hittite prince into Egypt where he could be quietly eliminated. The king sent his most trusted ambassador to Memphis to investigate the queen's sincerity and the true political situation in Egypt. What the ambassador discovered revealed a kingdom in chaos. Tutankhamun's death had created a succession crisis that threatened to tear Egypt apart. The young pharaoh had left no clear heir, and multiple factions were maneuvering for control. The queen's letter was genuine, but accepting her offer would mean entering a deadly political game where the stakes were nothing less than control of the ancient world's greatest prize. After months of careful deliberation, Suppiluliuma made his decision. He would send his son Zenanza to Egypt, but not as a naive youth walking into a trap. The prince would travel with a small but elite guard, and more importantly, he would carry detailed intelligence about Egyptian political factions that would allow him to navigate the dangerous currents of pharaonic politics. The journey south began in the autumn of 1322 before Christ. Prince Zenanza and his escort traveled through Syria, across the Sinai, and into the Nile Delta, carrying with them the hopes of uniting two ancient civilizations. But they were not the only ones moving across the Egyptian frontier. The aging advisor who had served under multiple pharaohs, had his own plans for the throne, and he had no intention of allowing a foreign prince to claim what he considered his rightful inheritance. What happened next became one of history's great mysteries, a tragedy that would shape relations between empires for generations. Zenanza never reached Memphis. Somewhere in the Egyptian desert, the Hittite prince and his guards simply vanished. No bodies were ever found, no witnesses ever came forward, and no official explanation was ever offered by the Egyptian government. When word reached Hattusa that his son was missing and presumed dead, Suppiluliuma's rage was terrible to behold. The king who had spent decades building diplomatic solutions to ancient conflicts now faced a betrayal that demanded blood vengeance. The careful alliance between Hittite and Egyptian interests shattered in an instant, replaced by a hatred that would define the next century of ancient history. But the true climax of this story lay not in vengeance, but in the response of Suppiluliuma's surviving son and eventual successor, Mursalai II. When he inherited the throne around 1321 before Christ, the new king faced a choice that would determine whether the Hittite Empire would be remembered as conquerors or as something far more significant. Egypt had murdered a Hittite prince and broken faith with their diplomatic agreements. Every tradition of ancient warfare demanded brutal retaliation. Hittite armies could have swept into Egyptian territory, laying waste to cities and enslaving populations in the time-honored manner of ancient conquest. But Mursalai made a different choice, one that would revolutionize how empires related to each other. Instead of seeking destruction, he sought justice through law. The young king established the first international court of arbitration in recorded history, demanding that Egypt provide compensation for his brother's death and guarantees that such treachery would never happen again. When Egypt refused, Mursalai didn't launch an invasion. He organized an economic blockade that cut Egyptian trade routes throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The conflict that followed was unlike any the ancient world had ever seen. Instead of armies clashing in decisive battles, two empires engaged in what modern strategists would recognize as economic warfare. Hittite diplomats convinced allies and neutral kingdoms to refuse Egyptian goods. Trade routes that had carried Egyptian wealth for centuries suddenly dried up. The pharaoh's treasury, dependent on international commerce, began to face shortages that threatened the kingdom's stability. This economic pressure campaign culminated in the most famous diplomatic achievement of the ancient world. In 1259 before Christ, Pharaoh Ramesses II and Hittite king Hattusili III negotiated the world's first comprehensive peace treaty between major powers. The document, written in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform, established principles of international law that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. The treaty went far beyond a simple agreement to stop fighting. It established mutual defense pacts, extradition agreements for criminals fleeing between kingdoms, and most remarkably, detailed procedures for resolving future disputes through negotiation rather than warfare. Both empires pledged to respect each other's territorial integrity and to cooperate in maintaining peace throughout the region. But the treaty's most revolutionary aspect was its recognition that true security came not from the ability to destroy enemies, but from the wisdom to transform them into partners. The document explicitly stated that the goal was not victory of one empire over another, but the creation of lasting peace that would benefit both peoples. The signing ceremony took place simultaneously in both capitals, with copies of the treaty exchanged between the royal courts. For the first time in recorded history, two major powers had chosen diplomacy over destruction, law over conquest, and mutual prosperity over zero-sum competition. The peace that followed lasted for the remainder of both empires' existence, nearly 2 centuries of stability that allowed arts, sciences, and trade to flourish throughout the ancient Middle East. Egyptian and Hittite merchants traveled freely between kingdoms. Scholars exchanged knowledge. Royal marriages cemented political alliances. The iron weapons that had once symbolized Hittite aggression became tools of construction rather than destruction. Yet even as this golden age reached its height, forces were stirring beyond the borders of both empires that would test whether their revolutionary approach to international relations could survive the ultimate challenge. Around 1200 before Christ, the ancient world faced a catastrophe that historians still struggle to fully understand. From the Aegean Sea to the Levantine coast, a mysterious coalition known to history as the Sea Peoples began devastating every civilization they encountered. These weren't ordinary raiders or conventional armies. They moved like a tsunami of destruction, leaving behind collapsed cities, abandoned territories, and broken kingdoms. The Mycenaean Greeks, whose Bronze Age palaces had dominated the Mediterranean for centuries, simply vanished. The great Minoan trading networks that had connected distant islands and coastlines crumbled overnight. Even mighty Egypt, protected by desert barriers and the world's most experienced military, barely survived the onslaught and emerged from the crisis significantly weakened. The Hittite Empire, despite all its diplomatic sophistication and military innovations, could not withstand this tide of chaos. Hattusa was abandoned around 1180 before Christ. Its massive walls and royal palaces left empty as the last Hittite kings fled or died defending their mountain strongholds. The empire that had revolutionized ancient warfare, diplomacy, and international law disappeared so completely that within a few generations, their very existence had become a forgotten legend. Yet their disappearance was not the end of their story, but rather the beginning of their most profound influence on human civilization. The technologies they had pioneered spread throughout the ancient world. Ironworking, which they had guarded so carefully for centuries, became the foundation of new civilizations across Europe, Asia, and Africa. The diplomatic principles they had established lived on in the treaties and alliances that shaped the classical world. Most significantly, the Hittites had proven that empires could choose cooperation over conquest, that strength could be measured by the ability to build rather than merely destroy. Their peace treaty with Egypt became a model that influenced Roman law, Byzantine diplomacy, and eventually the international legal systems that govern our modern world. The United Nations headquarters in New York today displays a copy of the Hittite-Egyptian peace treaty as a testament to humanity's earliest attempt at creating lasting international cooperation. The principles they established 33 centuries ago, that disputes could be resolved through law rather than warfare, that security came through partnership rather than domination, that true power lay in the ability to transform enemies into allies, echo in every modern diplomatic negotiation and international agreement. When we study the Hittites, we're not just exploring ancient history. We're examining the first civilization that faced the fundamental challenges of our interconnected world. How to maintain security without perpetual warfare, how to prosper without exploiting others, how to build lasting institutions in an unstable world. Their solutions weren't perfect, and they couldn't save them from the ultimate catastrophe that ended the Bronze Age. But their innovations in law, diplomacy, and international cooperation laid foundations that we still build upon today. The mountain people who learned to work iron became the architects of ideas that proved stronger and more lasting than any metal. They showed that the greatest empires are remembered, not for what they destroyed, but for what they created. In choosing diplomacy over domination, law over conquest, and partnership over exploitation, they created something that outlasted their cities, survived the collapse of their civilization, and continues to influence how nations relate to each other in our modern world. Stories like this remind us that the past is more alive than we imagine, and each archaeological discovery reveals new connections between ancient wisdom and contemporary challenges. The Hittites may have been forgotten for 3,000 years, but their legacy lives on every time nations choose negotiation over war, every time international law prevents conflict, every time humanity chooses cooperation over conquest. If you made it this far and aren't subscribed yet, take this moment to subscribe now, leave a like, and share in the comments what surprised you most about the Hittite Empire's influence on our modern world. Until the next video.